Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. There are just 3 things I ask of you, if appropriate to you and your experience. Please subscribe, please click on the like button, and please share this program link with any family members, friends, or colleagues who might be interested or benefit from the content. Now, on with our program. This is Mike Consul, your host. Thank you for joining us. What is the greatest novel of all time? Is it Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy? Is it War and Peace, also by Tolstoy? Some of our greatest literary thinkers cite both of those novels for that title. And does that make Leo Tolstoy the greatest of all novelists? Why has Russia produced so many great novelists? And why have names such as Chekhov and Dostoevsky and Pushkin and Gogol stood the test of time? What do the great novels they have written say about Russian history and its people? And what is the place of literature in today's environment, in Russia and around the world? These are difficult and maybe impossible questions to answer, questions that require a person who has deeply studied these issues and maybe even devoted his entire academic life to such questions. Well, we're in luck because in the spotlight is my guest, Gary Morson. He is a professor of arts and humanities and professor of Slavic languages and literature at Northwestern University. He's an expert in Russian literature. His work ranges over a variety of different areas, such as literary theory, the history of ideas, both Russian and European literary genres. And his favorite writers, Chekhov, Gogol, and above all, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He is especially interested in the relationship between literature and philosophy. He's currently working on a study of the brothers Karamazov, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Professor Morson, welcome to Novelist Spotlight.
I'm very glad to be here. Thanks so much for thinking of me.
Did I misrepresent you there at all? I say your particular favorites. I think I got this from some source material that above all, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are your 2 favorite Russian novelists. Is that the case, or is it like children? You can't pick a favorite.
Well, it's hard. Favorite is not quite the same as best, right? If you want, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are certainly the best. My favorite is someone almost as good, but not quite as Chekhov. He's really my personal favorite.
Tell me why.
Well, his sensibility is so appealing. He is, Russians tend to love to be dogmatic. They love big ideas. And, they're anything but modest, the great writers. But Chekhov genuinely was modest. He was something that is fairly rare among Russians, a natural skeptic. He was able, like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, to, get inside the heads of people. He's a great psychologist, but he was much less likely to pass judgment. He thought the job of a writer was not to answer questions, but to pose them in the right way and deepen them, but then leave it to the reader to answer them. I find that very appealing.
Interesting. So other than the ones I mentioned, Professor, are there any other classic Russian novelist names that you would add to that list, or does that pretty well encompass the really, the towering figures in Russian literature?
Oh, yeah, there are some, because most of the ones you named, for example, the 19th century, there I might add Turgenev, who is not quite as good as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but very, very good. And in the 20th century, recently there are some which are quite powerful. There's a wonderful novel by Mikhail Bulgakov, The Master and Margarita, one of the great novels of the 20th century. There's Solzhenitsyn's wonderful pieces which are harrowing to read because, he was in the Gulag and wrote about it.
Right.
Vasily Grossman has this amazing book called Life and Fate, a great novel. Some people think, I've heard people of real taste call it that the great 20th century novel. I don't think it's quite that good, but it's very, very good. In the 20th century, the great talents have come by thinking about the unprecedented horrors of Soviet totalitarianism, which raised the 19th century writers are also raising moral questions, but they take a particular intensity when the evil gets that great. That would suggest, well, why didn't the Holocaust produce things that were not just good, but of that level? And I can't answer that, but that's why in Russia, since it already had this amazing literary tradition, the way you answered any question was to do literature. So I guess the horrors produced, Solzhenitsyn and Grossman, and Pasternak, right?
Boris Pasternak, that's right. Yeah, Dr. Zhivago. What about today? When we talk about great Russian literature, we talk about the past. Are there great Russian writers today that are making a mark for themselves that in 50 or 100 years we'll still be talking about them?
Well, if you mean at that level of greatness and still alive, the recent Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, it might be of that level. There are some other very good ones, but nothing quite of that level, I think, right now at this moment. Now, I know there are some who I've praised who are going to be surprised that, I think that they're very good, but they're not Tolstoy, or Chekhov, But, literature is so important in Russia. There's no place in the world where literature is valued more in Russia.
Why is that? It's really lost its value in so many places. Here in the United States, I don't think it doesn't have the value it used to have, or anywhere near the value it used to have. Why is it so valuable in Russia? Explain that to us.
Yes, and even at its best, in the United States, it was never close to what, was in Russia. I'm not quite sure how you explain that, but I can describe it to you. The idea is, in other countries, you might think, well, literature exists to reflect life. But Russians are more likely to think that life exists in order to be made into literature. That's the purpose of life. Do you see? I mean, the only thing they regard their literature as essentially sacred. It's the only thing I can compare it to is how the ancient Hebrews must have viewed their sacred writings while it was still possible to add books to the canon, when it wasn't closed, right? That's how the Russians view literature. And so the greatest talents that they have, where somebody else somewhere else might become a scientist or a social scientist, in Russia, you become a writer. If you have the talent. And
so even to this day, Russian literature, the Russian people value literature at a very high level.
Yes, they do. They still today, even though, since the fall of communism which provided even more moral impulse, for literature, even since the fall of that, which has weakened it a bit, it's still, incomparably more important than anywhere else.
So what is the greatest novel of all time? Would you cite one? If you were part of those surveys that they do, and they talk to men of your education and caliber and ask, name the greatest novel ever, which one would you name, whether it's Russian or not?
Yes, it's interesting because Russian literature is so heavily focused on, the novel or the short story, whereas, the greatness of English or French literature is spread over many, many different genres and also goes back, English literature goes back to Beowulf. You really have nothing in Russia, of any significance before 1800. So it's all in a very short time, and it's almost all focused on realist fiction. So, you don't have great Russian tragedies. They have some great theater, but not at that level. So the novel is what they thought was, the function of things, the most important thing. There, I would say, I don't know, I have trouble picking among three. And whichever one I'm reading, I think is the best. War and Peace and Anna Karenina that you mentioned, and Brothers Karamazov are the three. If I absolutely were pressed to the wall and had to pick, I would probably say War and Peace. It's just spectacular. There's nothing like it except those other books, right? And Dostoevsky once said that nobody who ever lived, he said, had more raw literary talent than Count Tolstoy. It's like anything he touched with genius, right? A simple essay, and if I had to say what it was he had, it was an uncanny ability to understand the smallest movements of consciousness, the ones we're not even aware of ourselves that our minds are doing, because you can't focus on your mind too much or you won't be doing anything. When you do something, you sort of skip over things, right? Just the way when you drive a car, you're not conscious of every little muscle movement. If you did, you couldn't drive, right? That's true with our mental life, but then Tolstoy somehow can break it down to tiny, tiny little pieces and then reconstruct it, which is why he has that feeling of reality, that nobody else does. I mean, the most common thing that people say about Tolstoy, is, the poet critic Matthew Arnold said, Anna Karenina is not a work of art, it is a piece of life. And another famous comment was, if nature could write directly, without going through a human medium, it would write like Tolstoy. That is.
So he was gifted. He was gifted. And you teach graduate courses that are devoted to single novels, and they include Anna Karenina, the brothers Karamazov, and War and Peace, and then also The Idiot. Who's the author of The Idiot?
Well, I'll just say, it's not graduate. I teach undergraduate courses that way, to 17 and 8-year-olds.
Okay.
Because that's the way
I
get people to love literature. Let's give a whole class on War and Peace. They can read it slowly, and you can point out, this is how a good novelist would do this. This is how a very good novelist would do this scene. Now look at how Tolstoy does it, and they can appreciate what makes him so great. You see, but you have to read it very slowly, and you can't just assign the novel in 2 weeks.
Well, and it's a doorstopper. I mean, the thing is a tome. I mean, I think a lot of people have not read it because it's intimidating. The size alone is intimidating. It's very confrontational in a way.
Absolutely right.
So when you're in the classroom, talk about how your typical class during that semester, if you were to characterize the typical class, how do you teach or how do you review one of those novels? Say War and Peace. Let's stick with War and Peace. So are you asking the students to give their impressions on what they have read? Do you give them certain chapters to make sure they've read before the next class? What's the process? What's the syllabus on that?
Well, the class it's a lecture class, although there are discussions also, right, after the lecture. In the lectures, what I do is I give them, a Northwestern term is about 10 weeks. We're on a trimester system. So we read War and Peace in 10 weeks. Maybe that's 140 pages a week. And in each of them, I read aloud key passages. Passages that show what Tolstoy is doing, that are important for understanding the ideas. But I read them slowly and expressively, so if they hear the voice of the characters, they don't just skim over it, they hear it. And then I sort of pause back and comment, well, the reason he does it this way is this. What this means is that. And once they've seen, say, a given theme or a given way of handling psychology 2 or 3 times, then they can do it themselves after that. So in the course of, 10 weeks, they get to hear a lot of different things, but always focused on particular passages. You see, the real difference between a great writer and an okay writer is that an okay writer can be paraphrased and you don't lose very much. But a great writer can't. The greater the writer is, the less they can be paraphrased, right?
Why is that? Explain that.
Well, anybody can say, and then he felt grief, right? That might be a paraphrase. But to actually show what is going on in the soul to a person who's feeling grief, how it affects the way how he moves, what thought follows another, that's only a genius can understand how that works. But if you summarize, it would just be, well, he felt grief, you see. But to really understand how grief works, what it feels like, so that when you feel grief, you will recognize, yes, this is what my mind is doing, just like then. And you'll understand yourself better, you see. Because you'll be able to reflect, say, I know what grief feels, and I'm doing just like that, right? And you'll understand yourself better that way. Or if you felt that sort of grief, you will immediately, the passage will create the semblance of the emotions that you will recognize it must be true, because it makes me feel reading it a little bit the way I did when I was feeling it, you know.
I'm going to ask you to rattle off some adjectives that summarize Russian literature in what it deals with or what it encompasses. For instance, suffering or poverty. If you were to and use as many as you want, but I want you to kind of characterize and try to define what Russian literature really tackles in a significant way.
Oh, wow, that's a hard question. The two things,
because Russian literature is that broad. I guess I think maybe I'm of the mind. Disabuse me of this if that's what's called for here. But I'm of the mind that the Russian literature really deals with a lot of suffering and a lot of. Do you agree with that, or am I that's much too limited? Maybe to
no, but
to
that's
just say
very important in Russian literature. You know, suffering is. Suffering and what goes with it is empathy and compassion, identifying with the suffering of another, really feeling it from within. Those are all, important things in the great Russian writers.
What else is chief in Russian literature? There's the suffering, and what else would you name? Well, is that a fair question?
Yeah, no, I mean, suffering is certainly one thing. Svetlana Alexievich says at one point, suffering is Russia's basic, natural resource. We have more of it than oil, she said. It's a wonderful.
Oh, it's sad and it's funny.
Yeah, it's exactly. And the literature, well, in suffering, when you're not superficial, you really feel deeply, and you have to sort of understand things. Or if you live sort of on the surface, and happy-go-lucky, you don't really learn about who you are. Right now, so that's not a recommendation.
So there's enlightenment. There's self-discovery and enlightenment associated with suffering. Is that kind of the Russian attitude towards it? And not just the Russian attitude, I suppose, but if you don't experience a full range, I mean, even today, I know a lot of people who they won't go to a movie if it's sad, and I'm thinking, why not? Yeah, that's how you know you're a human being. You feel sadness, you feel happiness, you feel a lot of different things. You feel embarrassment. That's part of the full range of emotions, or what being a human being's about. But suffering is something. Obviously, people try to avoid suffering, and I'm sure the Russian people have always tried to do that, but it's inevitable.
And look at Russian history. I mean, I think there's a lot more extreme suffering among Russians in the last
23 million dead in World War II fighting off
something like that. Actually, but they're not
huge.
They're not all killed by Nazis. A lot of them are killed by the Soviet secret police at the same time. But 25 million, that's probably a rough figure for the number of who died during World War II. But a lot more than 25 million were killed by Lenin and Stalin gratuitously, just because they want to get rid of the middle class. They want to get rid of aristocrats. They want to, make the peasants collectivize when they don't want to. A lot more than 25 million people.
Mass starvation.
And Nazis, So
getting back to that question, though, I guess I went and rambled on there for a minute, so I never gave you a chance to answer the question about, is suffering a form of enlightenment or self-discovery? Is that part of the value of suffering, even though it's something we want to avoid?
Yeah, well, it could be. The Russians are really, the best Russian writers are really very subtle about this, like Dostoevsky. He knows that suffering approached in the right way can be a form of self-knowledge and enlightenment. But you can also approach it in the wrong way, and people do. That's one of the themes that he likes is people who deliberately suffer, who, let's say, like to be offended. They like to take offense, How dare you do this? Because suffering makes them, or feeling offended or insulted, makes them feel morally superior. And, we have a lot of that around all the time, right? People, make a mountain out of a molehill, as we say. They contrive.
Dramatize.
They don't have to. We have a lot of that now. They love being victims, right? And you get that in Dostoevsky, too. And in fact, nobody was better at understanding that psychology, too. It's a big theme in the Brothers Karamazov, where, one of the characters says, it can be very pleasant to take offense, he says. Not only pleasant, it can be positively distinguished to take offense. He's a really nasty, awful character who says that. But psychologically, he's right. So they understand.
I can really tell you're a college professor. Just listening to you talk I can just see you in the classroom in the lecturing. And I mean that in the best sense of the word, that you're deeply into the subject and you have a real passion for it and you express it vigorously. How do your young people who are in your class, when you're going through a singular novel, say War and Peace again, how do they relate to begin with? Is it a requirement or is it an elective?
Nobody is required to take my classes.
Okay, so they're taking it because they're interested in it. So you're getting people who have self-selected.
Yes.
Do they relate to it? Do they understand? Of course, they understand it, I would think, but do they relate to it? Or do you get a lot of people in the class who say, this is not relevant to my life or American living or modern life? Or do they understand that it's a time and a place? And find value in that?
It's really interesting. You asked that. My perspective is not all my colleagues think this way, but that if they don't relate it to their life, if they can't see why it's valuable to know, then the professor has failed. It doesn't matter how much the student may know about the writer, or how many pages students turn. If the student doesn't see that it's relevant to their life, as something to teach them, if they don't love it and want to read more, then the professor has failed. That's how I approach it. It's not the student's failure; it's the professor's failure at that point. As long as the student has done the basic work, if the student comes out not wanting to read more great books like this, then the professor has failed. And I'm pleased to say, I about 90% of my students, do want to read more, and every year there's a significant number, I can't tell you how many, who say, well, I didn't expect this, but reading Anna Karenina changed my life. I will think about life differently, which is what the Russian authors want to do. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to grab you by the throat and change the way you think about life. In Anna Karenina, it's a book about how we think about love. We think about it too simplistically, and the book is trying to tell us how many kinds of love there are, how you have to choose among them. They feel different. There are different values attached to them. There's not just one thing called love, right? And once you understand that, you will pick a partner very differently, and you look at marriage very differently once you understand that. And since all these kids are, like everybody else in the world, are interested in love, and they're, particularly when you're young, they're particularly thinking of how they want to structure their life around it. This speaks directly to them. So, I don't know, a professor who can't make a book like Anna Karenina relevant, there's maybe you should go into a different line of work, is what most of my colleagues don't think this way. So I'm just giving you my personal impression. Don't take seriously that I think they should go into a different line of work. That's just how I'm personally feeling,
What is the role of the novel today and I want to frame this as a young writer, maybe somebody taking your class, they want to become a novelist in the United States, writing in English, and they're trying to kind of wrap their head around what is the role of the novel today here in America. What would you say? I know that it doesn't hold the value to American readers that Russian literature holds to Russians, but realistically, what is the role of the novel in the United States today?
Well, here's
if you can assign
I want to exaggerate a little bit, but if somebody sits down and say, I want to be a writer what should the novel mean to Americans today, they shouldn't be a writer. They should be a journalist. It's a journalist who addresses the immediate needs of people today. And those needs are going to differ in 10 years and nobody's going to read the journalism anymore. But it'll have an impact at the moment. But the great novelist is interested in the ultimate questions of the human condition that are expressed differently in different cultures at different times, that will come out differently, will have different social ramifications, but the questions are eternal, right? Like one I just mentioned about what love is, right, and how to think about it. And the really great writers are writing for that. Okay, if I'm not appreciated now, I'll be appreciated 20 years from now. If I'm not appreciated here in America, I'll be appreciated in, China. I mean, that's how the really great writers think. 'Cause they don't want to waste their talent if they have it just on addressing some immediate question, which is going to be forgotten about in 5 years, right?
So in therein lies the answer to the ultimate question: why have Russian novels and novelists stood the test of time? Because they have dealt with questions that are timeless, with issues that are timeless. Suffering is never going to go away. Suffering is not fixed to a nation or an era, and neither is love. You mentioned love, or a lot of these questions. So, yeah, and nowadays we do see American writers really kind of fixated on the contemporary. And that's fine, except that they're so contemporary. They're dealing with questions of the moment, as you were saying, that if you're really just it's kind of a transitory sort of novel in that way, because they're not dealing with the big questions and that are just as relevant 100 years from now or 200 years from now as today.
Yeah, and that also tells you something about how to read great literature. One of the ways in which professors, high school teachers, kill an interest in literature. There are lots of ways that they do that, because most of my students have gone in having read literature but never understanding why it's worth reading. One of the ways you can kill interest in it is by saying, well, okay, here's a Dickens novel. What we're going to talk about is how he shows the terrible conditions of the working class in his time. He does, of course, but if that's all you see, that is, he's a document of his time. Look, a factory, surveyor's report of working conditions would do even a better job at that, right? That's not what makes him great, right? It's there, but what makes him great is things that if you don't give a damn about England at the time, anything about England culture at the time, but still find in him, that's what makes him truly great. You see, the documentary approach is if I were to teach it, well, this is a commentary on Russian culture in 1860, a student could plausibly say, okay, I'm not interested in Russian culture in 1860. Why should I care? See, that people do that, but I think it gets it backward. You become interested in Russian culture in 1860 because you love Dostoevsky, not the reverse, right?
Exactly. Now you lecture on literary theory. That's one of the courses you teach or lectures you deliver. Elaborate on that, literary theory.
Well, I only do that with graduate students. They're going to be professionals, right? With undergraduates, I want them, to love and know how to read literature well, right? And I don't want to waste their time by giving them some critics to read, right? There's so few undergraduate classes to devote to this. I want them to be reading great literary writers. But they get a little bit of theory indirectly, because when I, let's say, show them what Tolstoy is doing in a passage, the way I explain it, how he is conveying what the character is thinking, I know the theory and I can explain, through the theory to myself what he's doing, but I don't give them the theory. I just give them the results of it. This is what's going on here. You see how this sentence works? I don't quote any theorists, you see. So they get it sort of indirectly, but only insofar as it helps them understand the book. Graduate students, that's different. This is they're going to be professionals here. So they need to really understand the theorists themselves and how the theorists think and what the theorists' evidence is. But that I only do for, professionals. And most, undergraduates are not going to be literature professors, for God's sake. At least I hope not,
So you also lecture on the history of ideas and the relationship between literature and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts you want to impart on that?
Yeah, there are lots of reasons to read literature. Lots of things you can find, in literature. What I particularly love is psychology and philosophy, and the two are related because, if you ask what makes an idea convincing to somebody, it's usually not the logic; it's the psychology of the person. You need to understand it. So when I pick, sometimes I teach English literature, but when I pick to teach are works that are, either psychologically very subtle or rich in ideas, or preferably both, right? And then I read them in that way. And in a sort of sense, you could say I'm reading them in the Russian manner, I guess you could say, because that's what I'm looking for. But there are some wonderful, English writers who are very profound philosophically. I'm thinking of, in the 19th century, the great realist novelist George Eliot, real name Marianne Evans. Middlemarch is one of the wisest, philosophically richest novel ever done. Certainly the best written outside of Russia. The only one you can compare with the great Russian novel. But it's spectacular, profound, subtle. I mean, she really, she was essentially doing the same thing that Tolstoy was doing, but set in England. She's almost as good, So I like.
Yeah, one of the great novels. That one gets cited so often as one of the great novels. Why your interest in Russian novelists? How did it come into being? Did you read a Russian novel and it just lit you on fire? How did your interest, or maybe you were interested in literature and then you discovered the great Russian writers? Talk a little bit about how you became interested in Russian literature, and then to the point where you're teaching it and lecturing on it.
Yeah, it's a complicated story, but I'll give you sort of a capsule version of it. I thought I was going to be a physicist, and at some point I realized I didn't like messing around in the lab. I liked the beautiful picture of the world that you got from the great physicists, right? Whether it's Newton or Einstein, beautiful pictures. But then I realized that's not the science I'm interested in. It is the science, but what it really interests me is the philosophy in the science. So why didn't I study philosophy? So I would study philosophy. But then at some point I realized, people aren't convinced by logic of ideas. The question is, what makes an idea convincing? And that's the history of ideas. So you can locate it. So in this period, this was going on, so this was convincing. But that's social. What about the individual? Well, that's what you get in great novels. Great novels of ideas ask about the psychology that makes ideas appealing. And the literature that does that most of all is Russian. And since by that point, for other reasons, I could already read Russian, I gradually moved all the way from physics to Russian literature. It's not a common path, but it's why I still read a lot about scientific developments, and I love doing that. I have a great respect and love of science and scientific discoveries. And I guess that's one of the ways I'm different from most literature professors, because I had that route to come to it from the sciences.
What are you reading right now? Do you have a novel going that you're reading?
Oh, well, interesting. Recently I've been reading. I review a lot of things for national publications. And in the last year or so, I've pretty much been reading books about that they want me to review, and then that sometimes they're about the writers that those books are talking about. And the most recent book I read was about Chekhov, so I went back and read lots of Chekhov stories. So you could say that's it. I reread, for no particular reason, that book I mentioned before, The Master and Margarita, which I've always loved and loved even more this time. It's one of the great 20th century novels, and I can't tell you why I just picked it up again, but I did, and it was
But it compelled you to do it. It spoke to you on some level that you wanted to pick it up again. So what about somebody who is listening to this podcast and says, I haven't read any of the great Russian novelists, but I'm interested. Based on this conversation, I'm interested in learning more about them. Where would you tell somebody to start with Russian literature? Would you say just jump right in with War and Peace, or would you suggest a different book that's maybe less intensive?
Well, first question is, do they want to read something relatively long, or do they want to read short? If they want short, I would say pick up some of Constance Garnett's translations of Chekhov's stories. He never wrote a novel.
Short stories.
Yeah, he just wrote stories of various length, going from a few pages to 60 pages, right? And the translations really matter. So, hers are really superb, and some of the others are just terrible. You won't see what's great about them, about the work. Read those. If you want something longer of the great novels, the two, again, her translations are among the best always. Crime and Punishment of Dostoevsky, and Turgenev's, if you want something short but still a novel, his Fathers and Children, sometimes translated as Fathers and Sons. You get right into them. They're compelling. They're not nearly, I don't know, Fathers and Children is about a tenth the length of War and Peace, and Crime and Punishment about a third. But they're riveting, absolutely riveting. And then Chekhov's stories are easy to swallow. They seem so simple at first that you wonder why they're so emotionally moving. But that's, and that I could talk about, but you will feel them, how deeply moving and profound they are without quite knowing why. And that's a good start because it'll make you curious, you see.
So talk about what you hope to impart to your undergraduate students, because graduate students, I think, they've taken the leap, they've taken the full plunge, but your undergraduate students, when they come into that classroom and at the end of the semester, if you did the job you want to do, if you knocked it out of the park with them, what are they going to walk away with? What will you have imparted to them that they're embracing when they leave the final class?
Well, they will come up to me and say, what shall I read next? I want to do more. I didn't understand before why literature was interesting. Now I just got to read more of it, but I have so little time. Help guide me to what to read next. And then what I'll do is I'll say, well, tell me what you liked about the book. I'll find out something about their own personal interests, and then I'll make a suggestion from there, you see. But that's what I really want them to do. I want them to see that it's, they can get so much out of the great writers, not just the Russian writers, great literature, right? I just specialize in Russian, but I love great literature anywhere. Very often my students are grew up in a family that speaks another language at home, and I tell them, make sure you really learn this language. You've got a gift. Really learn it right, because you have such a big head start, and then you can read the great literature in Spanish or Polish or Chinese, right? It doesn't matter what it is. It's going to be some great literature, and you'll have direct access to it. If you just pick up the language you already have a head start on. So I try to tell them to, both to, love literature and then love whatever language they can learn easily.
So when the sun goes down and Americans are home, and this is not just Americans, people around the world these days, they'll tend to curl up with a movie or even more so, a streaming series, something on Netflix or Showtime or you name it, Prime Video, rather than curling up with a great novel.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about reading rather than, and I will say one of the great things that I see is that there's so many of these series that are on Netflix and other streaming channels, and so many movies that are made after books, that they take a novel and they decide, and sometimes they're nonfiction books, but many times they're novels, and then they create the series. Give them the reason, your average person, the reason why they should spend more time than they do reading than just viewing.
Well, when you're, the sort of books that can really be done well, like on, Masterpiece Theater or the BBC, right, are the ones that are good but not very good books, because you don't really lose much. You see, once you dramatize it, one of the things you lose is the voice of the author. But almost all the wisdom of the author comes in the subtlety with which she, I'm thinking of Jane Austen now, describes it. You make a story out of a Jane Austen novel, you have a good story, you'll get something. But what makes her books truly masterpieces is her own voice and the way she comments on, and the way in her own comment, her own narrative, she weaves in the points of view of the characters in her, in the way she tells things. That you won't get from, a dramatization on TV. For, a writer who doesn't do that, who just has a good story, that's okay. And, I could tell you, I don't know, that wonderful production they did years ago of Map and Lucia, the E.F. Benson books. I mean, they caught those beautifully, and not much was lost, because that's what they're good at, just those witty stories. But you're never going to get, never been remotely a production of, Anna Karenina that captured, even a tiny bit of what makes it so great.
Well, and so often, if you are a reader and you read a book, like you read a novel, and then a movie's made after it, almost inevitably readers are disappointed with the movie, because you just cannot. And actually, that is where streaming has made things much more realistic, that because it can stretch over 3 or 5 or 7 seasons, they could actually take a mammoth novel like War and Peace and try to bring it to the screen in a way that's much more comprehensive than a 2-hour movie can possibly do. But nonetheless, there's other factors there that are at work. For instance, and I've made a point of this on the program before, and that is that when you are reading something, you are a participant, and you create your own visuals for that. You are a participant. You're co-creating.
That's right.
Where when you're watching a movie or a series or a TV show, the director has made all the decisions for you.
That's right.
And you're just viewing. You are not a participant. And in today's society, one of the things that's very clear is that young people in particular, they don't like to just watch. They don't, for instance, they don't want to watch just a football game. They want to actually call plays on their video games while the game is going on and see how they do vis-a-vis Bill Belichick or Mike Tomlinson, or Mike Tomlin, I should say, and so on. But again, I get back to this whole idea of it's actually been, I think there's been more authors in recent years who have seen their work come to the screen, which is a nice thing, but it's still a different experience than actually reading what they have to write. How many professors are there out there doing what you do, Gary?
Meaning what? Meaning teaching literature?
Well, teaching. Well, there's lots of literature professors, but who else is out there who maybe you communicate with, who's doing Russian literature? Are there conferences you go to that are strictly Russian literature or Slavic literature? What about that?
Yes, there are professional organizations with, I don't know, I guess they have a few thousand members, not a whole lot. Not very many.
But if somebody said, "I want to study Russian literature," how many other people out there are competing with you for that student?
Oh, across the country? I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe a couple of thousand at most.
Okay, so there's a significant number. Northwestern is an esteemed, where you teach, is an esteemed university, and that's a factor as well. They want to go to a particular school.
We have, 5, tenured professors teaching different aspects of Russian literature. That's, for big research institutions, that's kind of a small number. 8 or 9 might be more like it. And you might expect those, at Columbia or Stanford or Berkeley. We're a little small, but that should give you an idea of the range. Slavic or Russian is, if a university has such a department, it'll be the smallest department. In many places, they just have one Russian person, so they put the person in a department of European languages. So they have one Russian person. But at least they do have one person who can do Russian literature there. At many very small colleges, which don't have a big staff because they're small, that's how they try to do it. And some of those people are really very good. I mean, some of them don't publish a lot, but that doesn't mean they're not great at conveying the greatness of the works. Many of them are really quite good, I think. And I've met many who are, made me wish I could sit in on her lectures,
By the way, I just quickly looked up, that number sounded so big when I said 23 million Russians killed in World War II, but I just Googled it and it says 6,750,000 military deaths and 7.2 million civilian deaths. So you're looking at, about 13, almost 14 million. I overstated that.
No, I don't think you did overstate it. I think your source is the problem there. The regional range professionals gives, somewhere between 18 and 30. So I don't know where you're getting that particular,
Well, this says, that's a World Population Review. There's another source here that says, well, there are varying numbers here. Yeah, you're right. So, and so I don't know how authoritative that source is. So at any rate, go ahead.
The Soviets used to say 20 million, but they had really no idea. Let me put it this way: in the siege of Leningrad, where the Nazis were, surrounded it to try to starve it out. Their goal was not to conquer the city, but to raze it to the ground. They wanted to destroy all of Russian culture, but they surrounded it for about 1,000 days. And well over 1 million Russians died of starvation in the city during that time. That's just in one city, if you know what I mean. So when you start thinking, well, 7 million civilian deaths, and then one city, it's over 1 million, it doesn't add up. Do you see what I'm driving at? And think about how many Jews were killed by the Nazis on Soviet territory. 2-3 million. So again, you add these together, and that's why I find that, and those are civilians, of course. It doesn't seem right, the figure you're giving. It can't be. Mm-hmm. In fact, most people think the Soviets now that they would give a higher figure than the Soviets did. But again, the Soviets are not. A lot of these people were killed, let's say, because look, the way the Soviets would, let's say, clear a minefield is to have people walk over it. Okay.
Oh God.
For example, if you want, we've got about 1 million people in the Gulag prisons. They want out. They can come here to walk over minefields. Okay? That's how they cleared minefields. Or when Stalin issued an order, we don't want you to retreat. The Russians had retreated thousands of, a couple thousand miles by this point. The standard way you handled it was to set up machine gunners behind the lines of the soldiers. So if they retreated, they would get machine gunned by their own people. Okay.
Wow.
A lot of people are, those casualties are, not just by the Nazis, but by, the Soviets themselves. Human life is cheap under communism. You understand that? It's social class that matters. It's the collective that matters. Individuals don't matter in Marxist, Leninist ideology, you see. So that's why you get that. And, that's why they're so similar to the Nazis, right?
Mm. So let me, we've covered quite a bit of ground here, Professor. Let me ask you, what haven't I asked you about? What other dimension to this would you point to Russian literature or the great Russian novelists that still needs to be stated that I haven't asked about or we haven't explored at all?
Well, some of the questions that have really concerned them are still of great concern. Again, they'll probably always would be. One of them that was very important, first in the 19th century and then later, was, they took seriously the idea that, well, there's nothing beyond the material world and material causation. That's a very common view, right? There's no God or soul, but immaterial soul. It's just cause and effect of matter. All you are is complicated matter. If you take that view seriously, where do you get good and evil from? Right? The fact is, there is no place to get it from. You can say, well, it's useful to do it this way, but lots of things that are useful aren't morally good. You can't get moral. You might get what's a better survival value that way, but lots of things that are good for survival value aren't, like killing a lot of people you don't like or aren't very good. And the Russians really worry about this. If we are nothing but material objects, what's the morality in destroying a material object? When I just, pulverize a stone, there's nothing immoral. If all we are complicated stones, why is it immoral to destroy us? These are the sort of questions that, have obsessed the Russians. And, the more our culture becomes materialistic or atheistic or, just we're nothing but objects, the more these questions matter, and they still matter very much, right? So, then they're asking questions like, if there's one thing that the Soviet period shows, it's what happens when there's only one party that determines exactly what's right and wrong, and there's no room for open criticism and dialogue. If you try to do that, you get shot. What happens when you have a society where, well, we're not going to let those people speak because they're purveying misinformation. They're lying. I remember when I first went to the Soviet Union, this is in the 1960s, I met this school teacher who, in response to the criticism that, well, you don't have any freedom of speech in the Soviet Union, she said, we have perfect freedom of speech. We just don't allow anyone to lie. Yes. And, 15 years ago, when I would tell that to my students, they would all laugh. They don't laugh now. They say, yeah, what's wrong with that?
Oh, God.
Well, listen, we just had, what was it that government thing that the Justice was, a misinformation bureau? How can you not think of they're going to, a government agency is going to determine what's misinformation? It sounds very Soviet to me, you see. And everybody knows that in universities now,
are under siege.
Topics you can't talk about because, you'll be ostracized or fired if you do,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you saw it now.
To me, in the way it didn't, even 15 years ago, most professors still all agreed had the same political perspective, but they didn't try to suppress other points of view, you see. They just held their own. There's all the difference between having, not too many people who disagree and actually thinking you can't disagree. And we've crossed that line.
Well, being a professor and know this very subject, if you haven't seen the series, it's on Hulu called The Chairman, which has Sandra Oh. Have you seen that with Sandra Oh?
I haven't seen it. Is it good, you think?
It's tremendous. Oh. The sad part is only one season, but they tackle these issues in a big way. And here's Sandra Oh, a Japanese American who becomes chairman of the department. And she's the whole thing is just, it doesn't matter that she's not a white male. It's just the students are running the asylum. It's a great piece of work, and she's just a marvelous actress. And so Bill the guy who plays Bill Dobson, Jay Duplass, I think, is the guy who plays. He's kind of the star of the department. He's a novelist who they brought in, and he's a star of the department. But he's got drinking problems and behavioral problems, that sort of thing. At any rate, and historically, when you're not allowed to say what you want to say, you say it through the novel, correct? Because you can actually tell stories and impart that message without people who are of that mindset, this kind of suppression mindset. They don't even get it half the time.
But nowadays you have, and in the Soviet Union, you had critics who would tease out the smallest, and you have it now, deviation. You didn't portray that particular person of that ethnic group in the right way, and you could get into real trouble that way. That did work, let's say, in 19th century Russia under the Tsars, where the censorship was not nearly as bad as in the Soviets, right? It was bad, but not like that. Or in, let's say, Louis XIV's France, okay? You didn't directly criticize the king, but you could get away with a lot by the method you're talking about. But when it really becomes, when cancel culture takes the extreme, as it did in the Soviet Union or Maoist China, then even that won't work. And that's why almost all the great literature in the Soviet period, it was either published abroad or was written, as they say, for the drawer and not published till 30 or 40 years later, or got people shot, And the official literature is almost unreadable. And fortunately, there's a lot of unofficial literature, right? And then to be a great writer, saying that meant you were risking your life. And so the prestige of writers grew even more than it had been before. And in fact, even to read these works, you were risking your life if you were caught with the wrong book, So, the importance of literature grew even more because readers were risking so much, you see.
Exactly. Interesting.
There's a very good book on this topic called Dangerous Texts, which you can see why dangerous for the reader as well as the writer, you see.
Our guest has been Gary Morson. He is professor of arts and humanities and professor of Slavic languages and literatures at Northwestern University. Professor, this has been a really interesting discussion. I learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you.